Okay, welcome everyone to the webinar on proportional representation and how it's made democracy better in other countries. So the first thing I want to do is just check that everybody can see and hear Dennis and I. So you should have either a question box or a chat box where you can just tell me yes if you can see me and hear me. I'm just going to find it here. Yes. Oh, goody. Okay. That always makes me feel better. Okay. So I don't have to do much on this webinar, which is really nice for a change. Dennis is going to do almost all the heavy lifting here, so I'm just going to introduce him. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Anita Nickerson. I'm Fairvote Canada's Action Coordinator, which just means that I help encourage, support, organize teams and volunteers across Canada. And today we have a special guest, that's Professor Dennis Pilon, who has been a wonderful support for our movement way back even before the first referendum in British Columbia. He's written extensively on this subject. He's probably one of the top experts in Canada on electoral reform and the Canadian context specifically. So it would take me a very long time to read you the list of all the articles that he's had published in various journals, mainstream media. He's written a couple of books that are a lot of us have read, The Politics of Voting, Reforming Canada's Electoral System, which he wrote about a decade ago, and we're still at it, aren't we, Dennis? Still reforming Canada's electoral system. So I'm going to turn it over to Dennis, and then when he's done, as he's talking, you can write your questions in the question box, and when we get to the end of his presentation, I will turn my webcam back on, and he and I, but mostly him, will answer all the questions that you had. Okay, over to you, Dennis.
Great. Well, thanks, Anita, and yeah, welcome everybody, and thanks for coming out to this tonight and joining us. This is really, though, I think your forum. I don't have a long presentation or long comments to make because I think that, you know, I find usually the questions that people have at these events are really the best questions because they're they're the things that are on people's minds. They're the questions that they get on the doorstep. They're the things that maybe their friends or neighbors have maybe heard about the topic. It's, well, what about this? And of course, they're often the issues that have been made political in the press. So if the media have been, you know, playing up this unelected member stuff that we often hear about systems with a party list component, or any number of other, you know, issues that are often fairly easily answered, but people often want to know, like, what should I answer? What is the right way to respond to these things? So I often find that it's just best to let people ask the questions, you know, the things that concern them, and then we can knock them around and see what we think. And often the questions themselves are betray, you know, different kinds of biases, not, I think, from the askers in this kind of forum, but that they are responding to questions that are often, you know, very, you know, they have some kind of political agenda behind them. So hopefully tonight we can take up all those concerns or anything else that you want to bring to the table, anything that I can offer some insight on. Now, as Anita said, you know, my research has focused on a number of aspects of voting system reform. One is that I've looked at the actual performance of different voting systems in different countries. Now, you would think this was well studied. And it has certainly been researched, and there's lots of academics publishing papers. The problem is that a lot of their work is sort of model-driven. You know, they come up with some sort of set of variables that they test against some results. And, you know, the research is not very satisfying because it's not very real-world applicable. If we want to understand how real voting systems work in real countries, we actually have to look at those countries. We've got to look at the things that are going on in them. We've got to look at the things that people care about politically. We've got to understand what's at stake for those people. And we have to be able to distinguish between claims that are about political differences and claims that sound like they're about institutions but really are just different claims about different political objectives, political differences. And sometimes, you know, they manifest in these claims about the system. So I find that the way in which we understand what would be the future in Canada, you know, with a proportional system, let's say, is to look at countries that are comparable to Canada and say what's happened there, what happens in those countries, and not just, you know, picking out the examples that make our case or don't, but looking at a pattern of behavior over a long period of time. Again, recognizing, of course, that no voting system is going to prevent revolution or fascism or anything else, any large-scale political upheaval. No institution stop that. We're talking about how well do, in regular circumstances, do these different institutions produce the politics that people say they want. And so that's where I think we can find some really good evidence and look at different countries and separate out the effects of institutions from just things that are political disputes. So I've tried to look at what has actually happened in countries around the world, but mostly Western industrialized countries, countries that are similar to Canada. You don't want to compare us to countries that are totally different than us, and that have a totally different history, a totally different political development, because you're just going to get ridiculous results. You've got to compare it to countries that are somewhat similar to us. So I do that. Of course, the other main area of my research is on the process of reform itself. So why and when do countries change their voting systems? And how does that happen? Why does it happen the way that it does? And of course, what my research, I think, demonstrates is that a lot of what we're told is not actually what's going on. So we're told that, voting systems are some sacred democratic institution that were, labored over by, people who were terribly principled, who only wanted what was best for the people. In reality, what we find is that voting systems were often desperate compromises by desperate people, people desperate to hang on to their privileges in the face of some sort of challenge. I mean, most Western countries adopted their voting systems at the point at which they became democratic. And there's a reason for that. The powerful often were terrified of what democracy would mean for them. And so they wanted to rig the game against, losing their privileges. Now, it turned out that the changes that they made in most countries actually worked in the public's benefit. It's one of those weird things where sometimes their self-interest works in our favor. But in lots of other cases, that's not the case. And so when we look at the past or we look at the present, we often find that political self-interest is the key factor that is motivating the political elites. And by political elites, a very broad group. I mean, we're talking, of course, about the political parties and the people who lead them, but also, the media are a political elite. They're mostly privately owned corporate entities with strong links to parties on the center-right. And so they're not neutral in these debates about how to improve our democracy. Now, I don't mean to say that everybody is self-interested, because I think that there are examples of people who are involved in politics who really do have the public's interest at heart. And that's, of course, where most of the progressive positive changes happen, right? They happen because, people of good faith who just want, the system to work more fairly, get off their duffs and do something about it. And so I like to think that that's what probably most of you are doing. You're getting out there, you're trying to chip in, you're trying to do your part. And if I can play any role in equipping you with some resources, some ammunition, to go out there and do the job, then I feel like I'm playing an important role. So I don't know. I mean, I think that's sort of a general introduction to the things that I do. And I guess just to wrap up my introductory comments, I just again want to highlight the political nature of what we're doing. I mean, obviously it's political in the sense that, I mean, it's politics, it's political parties, it's institutions that we connect with our democratic process. I mean, in that sense, it was all political. But by political, I mean that what is said is not often what is meant. And that in politics, a great deal of what is happening goes on behind the scenes or under the radar. And there are a lot of political actors who say one thing but are trying to accomplish something else. And that's part of the frustrating thing, is that we often hear, people make claims that are strictly about, winning the argument, not about the facts, not about what was right or wrong. There was a great professor of political science in Canada, Norman Ward, and he once said that a lot of the debates about institutions in Canada were really politics masquerading as principles. In other words, people claim that what they're doing is all about lofty goals, when in fact what they're doing is pursuing, their political objectives. So I think it's really important as reformers that you understand when you're dealing with those kinds of people, rather than, I think, everyday people who don't have an agenda, who just want to improve our democracy. And obviously, I think we can handle them very differently. So with that kind of general introduction, I don't know, it seems to me like we could just go to the things that are on your mind, the concerns you have, the questions, and let's just jump right into them.
All right. All righty. Okay, thank you, Dennis. So some people have emailed in questions, and I'm going to just start with one of the emailed questions. So this person says, this is from Ken, has any country shifted to PR from first past the post under stable people-powered conditions? It seems many transitions only happen after a revolting failure of democracy.
Well, not surprisingly, the issue comes up when people are unhappy with democracy. They don't tend to, talk about it when everything's going well. But if we again look at if we focus on Western industrialized countries, then most of the countries that we think of now as being fairly stable made their change under conditions that were anything but stable. And countries that we now think of as, just citadels of stability were actually in very unstable circumstances at the point at which they made their change. So places like Sweden, Norway, Germany, of course, they all made changes in conditions that were quite unclear about where things were going politically. Probably the most calm change that we've seen recently was New Zealand, where clearly the public was unhappy, but was the situation unstable? I don't think it was unstable. I mean, I think things were continuing, to go on. Stuff was happening in New Zealand, unlike most of the other examples that we could think of. So, yeah, I mean, I don't know if that answers the question for Ken, but in most cases, it is under conditions of instability, and that's important because it's usually at that moment that elites are worried enough to concede something. The problem for reformers is that those who benefit from the current rules are often, well, nothing will stop them from protecting the current system. As we saw this last year, the conservatives will throw everything in the kitchen sink at keeping the current system because it really is in their interest.
Yep. Okay. PEI in BC, as well as several municipalities, are making progress to shifting to PRs. Have previous shifts to PR occurred by regions of a country leading the charge, that is bottom up or top down?
Yes, I mean the previous patterns were very much on a regional basis. So if we go back to the earliest movement of proportional representation, that was serious. I mean, there was some discussion at the federal level in the late 19th century from the Canada First movement, an English rights group, but that never went very far. But the earliest was just before World War I, and there were a whole bunch of reformers who were taken up with this idea of voting system reform. Some were connected to the reformist wing of the Liberal Party. This is, of course, before there was a left-wing party in Canada, before there was a CCF or a Labour Party or anything like that. And so some of them were connected to the left wing of the Liberal Party, and some were connected with the early farmers' movement. So you see in places like British Columbia, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba, and in Ontario, farmers leading the way in a number of those provinces. So there were 19 municipalities that adopted proportional representation around World War I. And of course, 2 provinces adopted proportional representation combined with the alternative vote in rural areas. So Alberta and Manitoba both adopted this hybrid system around in the 1920s. So yeah, I mean, there's an example of a more regional breakthrough. That at the time, they thought that would become a kind of ripple effect in other places, but it didn't. Though, I mean, those examples did last a long time. In Manitoba and Alberta, they lasted for 35 years, which is not chopped liver. Winnipeg used PR municipally for 50 years. So we have lots of experience. But today, I think it would be exciting to see a breakthrough in PEI or British Columbia, two extremes of the country, because I think in our broadcasting age, where everything is instantly communicated, unlike the previous era, the contradictions would show up much more quickly. The fact that the results in those elections would be more transparent and more mathematically accurate, I think would raise some questions in other parts of the country and maybe spur some more action.
Okay. So these are kind of related here. What are the most important things we can do in between now and the next election to encourage a federal shift to PR?
That is a tough question. I think a lot of us got excited when the Liberals were elected and Justin Trudeau almost immediately said that one of the first things he was going to do was get on this file. This is the last election with first past the post. Wow. I mean, pretty shocking. It's not very often that those words come out of the mouth of a prime minister sitting atop a majority government. Minority government, maybe. But majority government, almost never. I mean, and I expected him to start to waffle. To start, well, we've got to look at it. Well, gosh, we did promise that, so, we're going to have a committee. But no, he was very clear. He said, that's it, we're going to get rid of it. And then, of course, we know what happened. I think he thought that he could jimmy in the alternative vote, the majority voting system, as a compromise between the conservatives who wanted no change and the other parties who wanted proportional representation. And when it was clear that wasn't going to work as a strategy, then he closed down the whole affair. What we know in Canadian politics is that PR gets a hearing when the Liberal Party is in trouble. If we go back to 1919, the Liberal Party adopted a platform at their very first convention supporting the adoption of proportional representation. Wilfrid Laurier, in the final days of the war, supported proportional representation, right? Long-time Liberal leader, former Prime Minister. W.L. Mackenzie King, longest-serving Prime Minister in the country, Liberal, promised that they would introduce PR in 1934 when he was opposition leader, and it looked like the Liberal Party coalition was breaking up. So, 1919, Liberal Party coalition looks like it's breaking up. Part of the party is going to the farmers, part of the party is going to Labour. 1934, again, the party system is in disarray. Looks like the Liberal Party's breaking up. Gee, fast forward to 2011, Liberal Party slips into third place for the first time ever. Looks like the party's breaking up, and suddenly the party is promising voting system reform. So I think there's a lesson for you, those of you who've been paying attention. There's a lesson in there about what happens to the Liberal Party, so goes the country on PR. And if the country turns around and gives the Liberals another majority government, then I think the lesson for the Liberals will be clear. We don't need to honor our promises. There's nothing to worry about. We're back to normal. But if the country says, we're not happy with you because you didn't actually deliver on the thing you promised, and somehow the Liberals don't end up back with all of the power, that I think is an important way to send a message.
Yeah, thank you, Dennis. That's great. I mean, I think it's also relevant, too, that we've been running a little campaign around the NDP leadership race, trying to encourage whoever wins to really take this up, because we're going to need somebody to carry that banner since the Liberals have dropped it and want to kind of shove it under the bed. We're going to need somebody who's talking about it a lot. So that's a practical thing that people can do, is to be encouraging the new NDP leader to really not just be mentioning this once in a while when somebody asks them, but to be proactively referring to the broken electoral promise and talking about PR. Okay, so I have, again, this is all along the same lines. This person is saying, my question is, what kinds of activities or workshops can we use to get people to learn more about and why? Clowns, bands? Reminds me of when we did the clowns. But I hear this frustration from people constantly, because once they get it, it's like they want everybody else to get it. But it's hard even to get everybody else just to pay attention to what it is. Like, I'll just give you an example. My husband's parents, okay, I think they're kind of on the conservative end of it, but they're aware that Justin Trudeau did something. But they said to my husband, we know he broke some kind of promise, but we don't even know what it's about. And that's the frustration. So do you have any ideas, Dennis, of how to get this more into the mainstream dialogue in a way that people can understand what went down?
This is a really important issue, because I think that when people get excited about this issue, like you say, they want to go out and they want to tell people about it because, they feel a real sense of injustice. They almost feel like, they've been fooled all these years. They've been going along thinking, we're a pretty democratic place and, fairness is what makes the rules. And then they discover that there's some really unfair aspects of what we're doing. And we're doing it because of politics, not because it's the right thing to do. But before you get too enthusiastic, before you run out there with your maps and charts and you've got to think about, how do you get other people to where you were, to that moment of discovery? And it often was a light bulb. Something went off for you, right? Something didn't add up, literally. And then that got you thinking about it. And so I think that it's really important that you speak to people's interests when you talk to them about voting system reform. You've got to speak to the things that they believe in. Forget all the technical stuff. That comes later. Once they're hooked, they'll want to know, right? But until they're hooked, until they see the injustice, they feel the sense that this is just not right, and I don't want to put up with it any longer. Until they feel that way, you're not going to be able to get through to them, trying to talk to them about the St. Log method of allocation and, how whatever other things that you think might be, even just trying to describe how the systems operate. People will give you a polite hearing. Go, oh, really? Well, what is that thing that you seem obsessed about? But, after a little bit of discussion about the single transferable vote or, the allocation method and mixed member proportional, they're just going to say, well, thank you very much and move on. I tell people that selling a voting system is like selling a car. You don't open up the hood as the first thing you do, right? You talk about the results. You talk about the performance. So that's the thing that you've got to focus on. You've got to say to them, wouldn't it be great if all our votes counted? Wouldn't it be great if all our democratic wishes were translated into representation equally? Isn't that just the basis of democratic fairness? Doesn't that sound right to you? And a lot of people will say, well, yeah, sure, isn't that what we do? And of course, it isn't what we do. And we know that half the votes are wasted. They don't contribute to the election of anyone. These are the kinds of insights that get people wanting to know more. So that's where there's a real room here for creativity. All of us can think, every day I come across some new, weird, interesting, creative approach that someone's taking to show what we're talking about, right? I mean, I can remember David's example of the Lego, trying to use the Lego in a couple of examples to show people the difference between the votes that were cast and the seats that were won. Just that small example of like, here's what people voted and here's what they got, gets people wanting to know more. That's where we need people. So if you're frustrated and if you want an opportunity to get people riled up and get them wanting to know more, then you've got to present the problem to them. So start with the problem that needs fixing and think of illustrative, creative ways of showing that will get people thinking, hey, wait a minute, why is that? And then they'll want to know more. Then they'll be willing to make the extra effort.
Yeah. And I would just add to that whenever there are surveys done, people strongly support proportional representation, but then if you ask them in a separate question what voting system we use, a lot of people think we already have proportional representation. So they really need to see those charts and Legos and all this stuff to realize that they're not actually getting what they think that we've got. They just haven't given it a lot of thought. A couple of people are asking about the recent elections this weekend in Germany and New Zealand with MMP, noting, so any observations yet on the recent New Zealand election? Did the role of their MMP system come into play? Has it been accepted now as part of the status quo, and the German MMP system and the results today? Any comments on that, Dennis?
These are great questions. I always find that the people who come to these webinars are equipped with razor sharp kind of questions, and that's great. The New Zealand election has produced some really interesting results over time. For instance, I wrote a piece for the Huffington Post on Indigenous representation. And there are some interesting parallels between New Zealand and Canada. I mean, in some ways we're not alike at all because they're a tiny island and we're a massive country. But they have a large Indigenous population, larger than ours. About 20% of the population is Indigenous, whereas ours is roughly 5 to 8%. Nobody's exactly sure. But they had a terrible problem of underrepresentation of their Maori Indigenous people in that country. And it was the same old story. They had some reserved seats, but the reserved seats were a tiny proportion of the total seats. And one party typically won those seats and took them for granted. And so it basically was a ceiling for the representation. And they brought in the PR system. Well, a stunning thing occurred. Very quickly, the Maori representation rose to its proportional level in the population as a whole. And there's a reason for that. It's called competition, right? Competition in PR systems is much more intense in the best way because it encourages parties to respond to what people want. And so instead of just one party being the party responding to Maori, suddenly every party realized that there was something in it for them, that there was a reason for them to cater to these voters and to listen to them and put up candidates of that group for their party, which meant that there was a seat at the table in each party for that group. And that's really important. It's meant that every government since then has had some strong Maori representation as part of the governing body. So, I mean, that to me is just a really exciting result. Exciting because it's not just been Maori who have decided to vote in the special voting areas, but it's Maori wherever they are across the country. And that could be the same thing in Canada. We have Indigenous people who live in the northern parts of our provinces, in rural areas, but we also have the vast majority of Indigenous people, sorry, I feel like I'm going to sneeze here, live in urban areas. And so they basically washed out, you know, by all the other voters. What may be distinctive about their vote, if they want to vote in a way that reflects their Indigenous experience, it's lost. But a PR system in Canada would do the same thing that we've seen in New Zealand. It would give that group, if they want, you know, if they don't want to, that's their privilege too. But if they do want to act collectively under the basis of that identity, they have a much greater chance of being heard. And the evidence from New Zealand suggests that they will be much better represented. It won't just be because somebody's decided that they want to make them a priority. It's because that group will be able to exercise some significant democratic power. Now, more generally, has the system been accepted? Well, they had a referendum recently in New Zealand. They initially had a referendum to bring it in, and then they had another referendum about keeping it, and voters voted to keep it. So now it's still contested, but it's very much along ideological lines. So the right, of course, don't want the system. They prefer first past the post, and so they are very keen to get rid of it. They haven't been able to succeed in doing so. Parties from the center to the left are much more interested in it, see some value in it, find it an effective way to manage a large coalition of different people and help hammer out some ideas about what they want to do. So, I mean, I think you know, we've seen a period of Labour government under the new voting system in New Zealand. We've seen a period of right-wing government. So the idea that it benefits left or right is really false in the New Zealand case. I think the evidence from New Zealand is that the MMP system is doing exactly what it was designed to do. In Germany, well, Germany, of course, has had a very special history, as anyone who's taken, you know, history in high school knows. I mean, it's a country that has had a very difficult transition to democracy. But in the post-war period, Germany has been a real light. They've managed to turn things around quite considerably and become one of the world's most stable democracies. So I think it's quite exciting to see what will occur. Will Angela Merkel be able to pull off, you know, another victory? Will other parties be able to put together some sort of governing coalition? Again, I think this is exactly what a PR system allows the voters to decide what they want to do by the votes that they cast.
Okay. Do you have any comments on the rise of far-right parties and the fact that we're seeing that representation in PR systems? This is what a lot of people are afraid of, and I've seen Mr. Trudeau capitalizing on this to the max.
Yeah, because first past the post never allows extremists to get elected. Trump. I mean, you know, the idea, I mean, in the UK, the UKIP party was seen as being quite an extreme party, and they elected representatives. Not just, people look at the national level and they say the results weren't that great, but UKIP did quite well in local elections across the United Kingdom using the first past the post voting system. So, and of course the problem is that, you know, first past the post has a very, very high threshold. It privileges a kind of two-party oligarchy that can crowd everyone else out, keep all competitors at bay because the cost to the voters are so high. But the problem is at a certain point it can flip, and then people can end up with very, very unnice results. The thing about PR systems is that they are more transparent. They do show people the real face of themselves, which does include some of these parties and some of these ideas. And so I guess the question is, would you prefer that those people hide out in the other parties, be a silent partner in some of the larger parties, getting side deals that we don't even know about or see? Or would you rather see them on the floor of the legislature and have their attempts to finagle deals be exposed through the proper political channels? That's what happens in PR systems. In PR systems, the cost of working with those kinds of parties is immediately transferred back into the political system. There's been some really interesting research on the rise of, you know, so-called extremist parties, right-wing parties, you know, parties that you know, some people don't like, and the results are quite interesting. Basically, what the research has shown is that yes, you know, support for you know, different parties, you know, anti-immigrant parties, anti-tax parties, it rises and falls. But what happens is that they only ever represent a small group of the voters. And as a result, they only elect a small number of representatives. And none of the other parties really want to work with them. So eventually the voters say, you know what, there's no point in voting for these guys, because even though we elect them and they say what we want to hear, they're not able to actually do anything. And, you know, that's something to keep in mind. When people say, oh my God, you know, we have PR, all these extremists will get elected, you know, at the end of the day, regardless of voting system that you use, people don't want to waste their own time. People want to be effective. People want to vote and get stuff done. And to get stuff done in a PR system, you're going to need to work with others. You're going to need to play well with others. You're going to need to be able to work out compromises with people who also have good ideas, but maybe slightly different ideas than yours, and find ways that everybody's getting something of what they want. And that's really the PR way. So, you know, myself, I always think it's better that we look everybody in the eye, right? That we hear them. You know, we hear what they have to say. You know, they say that a stop clock is right twice a day. And, you know, even extremist parties may say something that we would all go, that's an interesting point, every now and then. But I think it's better that we can see them, that we know what they're saying, precisely so that we can respond more effectively, so that others can openly challenge them and organize against them. That, to me, is really the quintessential political democratic system.
All right. So this person's, I'm just going to kind of summarize what she's asking. She's just talking about how to appeal to the right. You know, she's saying that no matter how many times she tries to have a conversation about fairness and all this kind of stuff with the right, it seems to go nowhere, and this is mainly seen as a left-wing issue. Is there a way to bridge that gap, I guess?
This is a really good question, and I appreciate the question, the person who's asking it, because they're taking up some pretty hard work. I mean, I have to applaud your bravery in wanting to go into a group that seems quite hostile to the topic. But, you know, there are people within those groups who do support it. You know, we know for a fact some high-profile conservatives at various points have come out and said that they think a PR system would be better for Canada. And of course, the right is not completely unified on everything. I mean, this last leadership election at the federal level spawned a group that basically wanted to organize a kind of old progressive conservatives group within the Conservative Party to try to champion more centrist views. So the Conservatives themselves are a coalition of different interests, and so we have to keep that in mind. What we find with Conservatives is the longer they're out of power, the more interested they are in some of these things. So when the right had fractured into two parties, the Progressive Conservatives and the Reform Party in the 1990s, suddenly they were very interested in voting system reform. Their intellectuals, like Thomas Flanagan, published a number of pieces calling for the introduction of the alternative vote. So, you know, part of it is, what are the facts on the ground? As long as federal conservatives think they can win under the current rules, nothing will move 95% of them. I mean, they really are a power-first party, and everything else be damned, right? Because everything is in the service of getting power. You know, across the country, things are different. It depends, you know, locally or regionally, we might see a breakthrough. If some conservative groups are more marginalized, they might be willing to stand up and say they think there should be a change. But I think, you know, one should always talk about voters. We should talk about the fact that conservative voters are not getting what they voted for. That there are conservative voters in parts of our country who never, ever, ever contribute to the election of the conservative views that they support, and that's wrong. And that's what I think I say that at every talk that I go to, that this is not a left-wing issue in the sense that only left-wingers stand to benefit from it. I think that, you know, people who vote, all votes should count. All votes should count equally. And I think that people who live in certain areas should not be discriminated against just because they're surrounded by people who don't agree with them. I think their vote should still contribute to the election. And I think that would affect the coalitions. I mean, imagine what kind of coalition the Conservative Party would be if some of our urban cores, which have considerable conservative support, were actually able to contribute to the election results. I think it actually would make a difference. So I think there are some themes that you could touch on with conservatives. And there are some conservatives, like Andrew Coyne, who are quite principled about the idea that just as with markets, buyers should make the decisions about what they want and not governments. That's his view. He also believes that voters should decide who gets elected, not voting systems. And so the voting system should be a means of doing what voters say with their votes. You will find some of those people on the right who have that principled position.
Okay, so this is kind of related to what you've already answered, but it might be worth talking about anyway. This whole argument of the tail wagging the dog, and you saw probably Bill Thielman's refreshingly predictable piece in BC the other day, claiming that, you know, because the $10 a day daycare wasn't in the very first budget, that means the Green Party is holding the NDP hostage. And this, we're going to see more of this kind of language of a small party disproportionately controls the agenda. How do you respond to that? What does the research say about that?
Well, again, I think that we have to try to use facts to challenge these things, because that's just not what occurs, you know, in countries that use PR. So, you know, people can make whatever kind of wild speculative claims they want based on nothing, or we can look at what is the consistent pattern of influence. And what we know from Europe is that small parties that are too demanding get booted. They get booted out of the coalition, or they get booted by the voters. You know, voters are a funny group, right? We tend to think of people taking sides as being very entrenched. Certainly there are those people, right? People who just, you know, my party, do or die, you know, they would never change their views. But a lot of voters actually have a very strong sense of fairness. And when they feel that someone is being unreasonable or unrealistic, they kind of get ticked off. And that's what's happened repeatedly in Europe, where a party is seen to be making demands that are not reasonable. And then their share of the vote falls in the next election, because people just say, you're not being fair. You're not playing fair. New Zealand's first election, New Zealand First was the kingmaker between Labour and National, the right-wing party. And New Zealand First had indicated in the run-up to the result that they were going to go with Labour. And a lot of voters thought, okay, well, that's good. I mean, maybe that's what I want. Maybe some people who voted New Zealand First voted for them thinking that's what was going to happen. But after the election, New Zealand First changed its mind, and it made a deal with National. And a lot of their supporters were angry. And in the very next election, they lost a considerable amount of support. So this idea of the tail wagging the dog is a made-up problem, made up by opponents of change, who their argument basically is, well, my party doesn't have enough support to win, but I want them to win anyway. You know, I don't have enough votes to win, but I should be able to ram through my stuff anyway. And that's just not on, okay? The bottom line is, you don't have the votes, get out there and play nice. Figure out how to make deals so that, you know, we can come up with something that everybody's happy with. And ultimately, the voters will decide whether or not they think it's a good thing, right? If people are upset that the NDP weren't able to do their $5 or $15 a day daycare idea, and if they think the Greens are responsible, you could bet in the next election it would be reflected in the results in a PR system. You know, that's what happens. And that's what's great about PR systems, is that as communication devices between voters and political results, they're much better. They convey a much more complex message about what voters want than our current voting system. So again, the tail wagging the dog argument is the classic argument of opponents. I mean, really, these are people who don't want change. It's an argument that's offered just to try to justify the unjustifiable, that someone with 40% of the votes should get 100% of the power. That's what they're saying. And if you agree with that, if you think that that's a great way to do things, well, then you might find what they're saying reasonable, but I don't. It's logically fallacious. It just doesn't make any sense. And it doesn't match up with the actual results of countries that have a long experience of using PR. So that's the way that I would respond.
Mm-hmm. And one of the interesting things from our last webinar was just talking about very small parties will often choose not to go into a coalition, because once you're in the coalition, you can't criticize the government. And very small parties, contrary to what we're hearing in the media, actually have very little influence on what gets done. It's the main party, the big party, that's the driver. So sometimes, like in BC, they want to be on the outside in a supply and confidence agreement so that they can get their message out there and be heard, but they're not driving the cart.
Or they want to be on the inside because they need to give their voters a win. Okay, as I said, politics is about getting stuff done. And sure, sometimes politics is about speaking truth to power and being a witness for something that you think is important. Great, I'm not disputing that. But at the end of the day, you know, most political parties want some concrete results that they can go back to their supporters and say, voting for us wasn't a waste, you know. We got some stuff done. We did what you wanted. And so there are powerful reasons for small parties to cooperate effectively within coalitions, and there are powerful reasons for them to say, you know what, we're going to step outside and let the government run, and we're going to continue to criticize it because that's what maybe we want or our voters want. Absolutely. Again, the best way to look at these questions, these problems, is to look at what actually happens in countries like Canada that use PR, rather than listening to speculative blowhards who really don't know anything about what they're talking about. I'm not naming.
No, of course not. I'm going to remember that term, Dennis. So this person asked, what does your research show about the impact of PR on major public policy innovation in the countries where it's been present for some time? Specifically, how does the frequent need to form coalition government tend to drive political parties toward the, quote, mushy middle, to adopt, quote, safe policies, the policies of the middle of the political spectrum? Okay, yeah, that's the gist of it.
That's a really good question, because it really gets to the heart of what's at stake. What's at stake in politics? What are people trying to accomplish? And what will be the dynamics politically? And people worry that, how does change occur? And change often occurs because there's a canary, in the coal mine somewhere, making some noise and alerting people to a problem. And that is often the role of small parties, regional parties, parties that are not in the center, parties that are not the largest parties. What happens in PR countries is not really what was described by the questioner. But you can see why people would think it would work that way, right? They would think that, first of all, they think that the governments don't last very long, but actually they do. PR countries, the governments last almost as long as first past the post countries. Again, it depends on what you mean by a government, right? I mean, in this country, we're going to see a cabinet shovel. Is that a new government? When Trudeau changes, the people who are his ministers, is that a new government? Or no, we all think it's just the same government, but he's just rearranged the deck chairs. Well, it's the same in Europe, right? Sometimes they call something a new government, but really it's just the same people, but they've got different cabinet positions. I often look at elections as a much better way of comparing, how unstable is the system? I mean, that's at the heart of the question, right? Is that, is the system less stable? Does it force politicians to just go for the easy win? That's one of the concerns. But actually, it doesn't appear that the governments fall or that things are so unstable that they have to go back and have an elections. There's often fewer elections in Europe over the same time period than there has been in Canada. So that tells us that those governments have often been very stable. They've been able to live out their term. Let me give you some insight into the way in which policy is put together in PR countries, because it's not what people think. People think that it's some sort of ruthless game of chicken, where different parties are holding their cards close to their chest. No, what happens is everybody sits down and they say, okay, here's what we want to accomplish. Here's our goals. Here's our highest priority. Here's our lowest priority, and here's everything in between. And then they hack it out. They hack it out and they say, well, okay, I think we could work with that, and I think we could include this. So what you end up with is a very complex process of policy development in countries with PR. And that's why PR countries are often leaders in policy innovation, because they don't, it's not an all or nothing battle. It's much more a collaborative process. Coalition building builds a bigger tent. And unlike our parties, which often say very little about what they're going to do because they don't want to offend this group or offend that group, and they don't want to be tied to anything when they get into power, in the PR system, everybody has an incentive to say what the hell they want to do and how it's different than the others. And then when they try to put together a government, all those different policies are there. So it's, to me, it's a much better way of making policy. There was a Dutch prime minister from the 1970s. Who was doing an interview about the policy process in the Netherlands. And he said, contrary to the question, that actually it takes a very long time to make policy in the Netherlands. Why? Because everybody's got an opinion, and they have to work out an agreement amongst different groups. But he said, policy works better in the Netherlands. Why? Because there's more buy-in, right? The policy that is passed often has not just 50% plus one of the support in the legislature, but often 60 or 70% of the support. And that means that 60 to 70% of the voters are behind the policies that are getting passed. And that is very different than in our country, where governments introduce policies on the basis of a vote, 39% of the vote, and then not surprisingly, those policies do not have legs. They do not have support in the broader community, and they don't work because they don't have that support. People don't understand how they work or what they're supposed to do. And when the new government comes in, it's easy for them to take it out. It's unproductive, it's wasteful, whereas the policy process in the PR countries is much more rational, much more productive, much less wasteful of public resources.
Yeah. Just to comment on that too, some of you probably know there's an opponent group called Keep Voting Simple, and sometimes I get sent some of their emails. They're basically conservative party strategists. Okay, anyway. And liberals. And liberals, yeah. Can't.
High-powered liberals and conservatives.
Right. So anyway, one of the more recent emails was about the Netherlands and how it takes them months and months to form a government. And so this was, you know, interesting for me as a layperson. So I kind of looked into this. How long does it actually take on average for a government, a coalition in a PR country to get up and running? And the average was 29 days. And in some countries like Denmark, the average was like 4 days. Ireland, 19 days. You know, so Netherlands, because they have a pure PR system, which isn't even on the table for Canada, with so many parties required to form a coalition, it does take them longer to negotiate an agreement. But that's not the case. And frankly, I'd be willing to sit and wait a few weeks for 2 or 3 parties to put forward a written agreement, which is what they usually are, for a set of policies that, like Dennis just said, is broadly supported, than somebody that can get up and running the next day and ram through a whole bunch of things that most of us don't want. So those are kind of the choices, right? Okay. Here we go. Yeah, you know what? See, I'm getting the same question over and over again about kingmakers, tail wags the dog, small parties having too much power. This must be something that people are really, really afraid of. Is it possible? Okay, is it possible to correlate different versions of PR with a bias towards certain kinds of parties? So, in other words, are some kinds of PR going to benefit certain parties more than other parties?
That's an interesting question. Certainly, you know, there are PR systems that are less proportional than others. So obviously, in that sense, those systems can be seen to be favoring, you know, larger parties. This was an argument that was often made about SDV, the single transferable vote, was that because the threshold you know, people are elected in seats that are like 3 to 5 members typically, and so to gain a seat, you need a quite considerable amount of startup support, right? If you're in a PR system with a 4% threshold, maybe you only need 4% in the whole country, but in an SDV system, you might need 17 or 20% to get your first member. Interesting, though, again, you know, it theoretically possible, but practically, when we look at countries that use the system, what we discover is that, you know, nearly every party has some regional basis of support. So even though Ireland uses SDV and uses ridings that are 3 to 5 members, they've elected parties that nationally have only 4% of the vote, which, you know, you would think isn't possible with SDV, but it's because that party has certain regional concentrations of support which allow it to win a quota in different parts of the country. So again, we've got to be careful with some of the generalizations that we make, because in practical terms, when we look at what the systems actually produce in real life political contests, we see that a lot of the voting systems don't produce the results that you might expect. There are examples in a number of countries that are using systems that are not quite proportional, and they are very clearly biased towards larger parties. There's various ways in which voting systems can be manipulated so that only certain kinds of parties will benefit, either through regional allocation rules or group districting. So some countries use the whole country as a basis for a national allocation, but others break it up in the countries so that, you know, you have to get your proportion within, say, a 20-member riding, which, you know, could discriminate against a party that has a small level of support across the country as a whole if they really are dispersed across the whole country. So, Yeah, I mean, but on the whole, when we look at, again, Western industrialized countries, and we look at the broad things that people want to see represented, most PR systems do a good job of representing those things. So I'm not as concerned, if we look at the choices that we could make, and, we've seen, for instance, the recent PEI referendum, that people have come up with some really creative approaches to doing PR in Canada, all of which, the simulations I've seen suggest would be quite accurate in their representation of our political differences.
Right. Okay, so this is more of a comment than a question. Somebody's just commenting that the MMP system in New Zealand, they have a 5% threshold. And one of the things that came out of the review of that system in 2012 was a recommendation to lower that to 4%. Of course, the National Party, if anybody thinks Conservatives can't win with PR, they have had 3 terms in a row, the large right-wing party in New Zealand. Voters get what they voted for. But anyway, the review recommended lowering the threshold to 4%. And of course, National wasn't too interested in acting on the recommendations of the review. But now that we may be getting, possibly, a Labour-Green coalition government there, this person's just commenting that now the Green Party may well say to Labour, it's time to implement that recommendation as a condition of our support. So I'm just throwing that out there. So, I mean, I think it's a way political systems evolve is by the interests of those who have some influence.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen some debates in Germany, since the system was introduced in the late 40s, that that also suggest that they've changed their percentage, and they've changed the way it's allocated a number of times in the country. So it's possible to make those changes. You can bet that the parties that are right on the margins are going to be very attentive to how these changes are going to affect them, not surprisingly. My own view is that I think it's important that voters get what they want. So whatever rules we come up with, it should be rules that respect the broad things the voters are saying that they want. We don't want a system that appears to be arbitrarily excluding certain groups.
I think one of the things to note too is that now New Zealand has, I think, 5 parties in their legislature, and we have 5 parties in our legislature, and Germany has what? I haven't checked the latest results, but it was 4 parties in their legislature. So this fear that, a reasonably proportional system is going to lead to an explosion of these fringe parties just doesn't usually materialize.
Again, what is forgotten in these speculative outbursts is that people want to get stuff done. In PR systems, most people vote for major parties, larger parties, and then a considerable number of people vote for smaller parties. I don't like terms like fringe party because fringe party, I mean, everybody starts off on the fringe usually, and some fringe ideas, become the mainstream eventually. The people who use that language are often showing their hand in terms of what they think about the political system. But yes, you're absolutely right that when we look again at what actually happens in PR using countries, the number of parties that are on the table may get larger and smaller, in part because what voters want may change. And also voters judge what's going on in the political system, right? They judge how effectively it's working. And so some voters who are supporting a smaller party might say to themselves, you know what, this isn't really working. I think I'm going to give my support to the larger party because I think that it's time for us to move on the issues the larger party is raising. So again, the bottom line is that there is no, we hear people say, well, PR encourages smaller parties. No, it doesn't. PR just allows voters to vote for those parties if they want to. If they don't want to, there's nothing in PR that makes them do it. And in fact, we see in PR systems that most voters vote for larger parties. Most of the Western PR systems have party systems that are not that much bigger than our party system. So again, these claims are not supported by any facts. They're usually just anecdotal. They pull out the example that they think makes their case, and they count on the fact that their listener is not very well informed.
Right. Yeah, and that kind of ties into something last time we had a TD, which is like our MP from Ireland on, and I had a phone conversation with her, and it just kind of struck me because in the last election with single transferable vote in Ireland, they elected something like 20 independents, which is kind of amazing. And so they have this kind of minority government. It's a little bit complicated there compared to what they usually have. And she said she didn't think it was going to work out very well, and that basically the voters would fix it next time. It was
Well,
a comment, basically the voters will fix it. They'll look and see if did this work. Okay, we didn't like the big parties. We voted for all these little guys. How's that worked out for us? And if they don't like it, they'll vote them out. And how nice it must be to be able to do that.
isn't that the best way to do things? Isn't it better to let the voters solve the problems? You know,
Yeah.
we get it in both directions, right? We hear that SDV is a system that won't allow smaller parties to get elected. That was one line Bill Thielman, span, back in the first referendum on it. And then we hear that, oh, the system will allow all these independents. Again, the practice in Ireland, which has used SDV now, since 1922, so they've had a lot of experience, almost a century of experience with single transferable vote. And yeah, some very interesting patterns. For the most part, it's been a system dominated by a couple of parties. It's been a very stable party system. There's been some changes at different times. Recently, there's been some upheaval, just like there's been upheaval in every party system, right? First past the post systems, the American system, here in Canada, all across Western countries, we've seen voters striking out in new directions. So, to say, oh, the voting system is responsible is, typical, right? It's typical. Either the voting system is not worth it, it doesn't do anything, or it does everything. When in reality, of course, voting systems are important. They do have impacts, but not just in any old way. They have an impact in a way that is working or channeling the political activity that's actually going on in the different countries.
Yeah. Okay, so a couple of people have asked me this because of the title I put for our little session today about how PR has changed politics for the better. And I think you've kind of addressed that. You've talked about how policy making is different, how representation is better. Is there anything else that you wanted to add about how politics or how democracy looks different in countries with PR? I think, for example, a lot of people are hoping to see a little bit more cooperation and less attacks.
Well, I think that is a good point. I think sometimes people have unrealistic ideas about political encounters. Politics, the great benefit of democratic politics should be that we can disagree peacefully, that we're allowed to disagree, that it's okay. Not all political systems allow that, right? Not all political systems and political models or governing models around the world have any room for people to challenge each other in a way that could have people reevaluate what they're doing. Democracy was an amazing accomplishment, and one that we have to constantly try to protect from those who would try to take it away, who would try to minimize it, who would try to make it serve only the powerful and not the rest of us. So it's really, really important that we don't mistake people debating, people disagreeing democratically for being a problem. Because that's a great strength of our system, is that we can do that. And sometimes our media do a disservice when they characterize political debate as just whining or kvetching or people just for no good reason, when often people are disagreeing for very good reasons. But I do agree that sometimes I think that our first past the post system encourages politicians to throw mud at each other because it's an all or nothing battle. It's an all or nothing battle. Even if they want to say something nice about each other, they can't, right? Even if they want to credit each other with something, they can't. Because come the next election, it's a life and death battle in every single riding. So you can't get up on the podium and say, well, my colleagues across the floor were actually really good on this, and I hope people support them for that, because you're signing your own death warrant, politically. And that's just a great flaw of the first past the post system, is that it doesn't allow for that kind of cross-pollination. So I guess I want to caution people. A PR system, one of its great benefits is that it accurately reflects our principled differences politically, and that's a good thing, right? That's not a bad thing. But the way in which those differences are set up to interact is much different. In a PR system, there are many, many more incentives for people who disagree to look for ways to agree. There are ways for people who are competitors to be able to credit one another with a good working relationship on political issues and signal to voters that, hey, we're working together because we want to accomplish what you want done. That's possible in a PR system in a way that's very, very hard in a first-past-the-post system. So I just think, we got to separate out those different ideas.
Yeah. So this person wants to know, is a minority government a prerequisite to electoral reform, or have there been countries that have transitioned with a majority government?
Oh, okay. Wow, put me on the spot here in terms of looking at. I mean, I think if I went back to my book and I looked at the examples, in the 19th century and early 20th century, there probably was an example of a country where a party had, a majority, but feared they were about to lose it. That's pretty crucial. Part of what happened in Manitoba in 1920 was there was a Liberal government in power provincially. There'd just been a huge upheaval in the province, the Winnipeg General Strike, one of the most important catalysts in Canadian political history. And it had really highlighted the tensions coming out of World War I in terms of the haves and have-nots. And the Liberal premier was terrified that they were going to get wiped out. And so even though he had a majority, he was prepared to author a major change in the voting system because of what he thought was coming. So that's a factor, right? If politicians think that the death knell is nigh, then they're often very willing, and they will make changes like lickety-split. I mean, lightning fast, The changes that were made in Manitoba were made like the fastest you could imagine, right? 10 days, they had made the changes. So, when political elites are motivated, voting system reform can happen very quickly. But, you're probably right that a minority government is a greater opening to change than a majority government, though it's not necessarily so, because a minority government in our system almost always turns into a majority government eventually. And so our two major parties at the federal level, just to give you an example, the Liberals and Conservatives, really, there are powerful forces in both parties that just do not want to change and don't understand why anybody would talk about it. What, are you crazy? This system works for us. I mean, that's surely what was going on in the back rooms of the Liberal Party when Trudeau floated this idea. Some people were like, are you nuts? Like, just shut up and let's keep this system. So that's the thinking. But as I said, when powerful forces think that they might actually be cut out, then suddenly they're much more interested in talking. So I don't think minority government on its own is enough. I think that in the Canadian context at the federal level, you're going to need a Liberal Party on the ropes that is really worried about its future.
Okay. Okay, so somebody's asking about Italy. Obviously, still, since I've been in this cause, Italy and Israel. So they're asking about Italy specifically, and they have heard that Italy does not have a PR system right now, and they would like to know, is it a PR system or not?
Well, to my understanding, Italy's system is still a PR system. Now, I mean, it's been a long and interesting story. After the end of World War II, Italy reverted to a proportional system, and then they did various gerrymandering and dirty tricks. Eventually, the system stabilized around a fairly open party list PR system with some interesting wrinkles that would eventually come back and bite the political class in the early 90s. In the early 90s, the public mobilized, they were angry at the politicians, the level of corruption in the Italian system had come to light and people were quite angry about this, and they used what's called an abrogative, basically a referendum process that can remove a law. And so they used that process to remove a key component of the voting system, thus transforming it from a PR system to something else. So for a while, they were using something else that was sort of, it was like a kind of parallel system. It wasn't PR, but it wasn't first past the post. There were groups that wanted just them to adopt the British, Canadian American system, but there were many more that didn't. And so in 2005, the country reverted back to a fully PR system. So from 1994 to 2005, they used some other hybrid system. Then in 2005, they reverted back to a PR system. Now, since then, they have been continuing to fight about changing the system. And the previous Prime Minister, Matteo Renzi, who was heading up the center-left party coalition, he made it a condition of his continued leadership that they make this change. but he lost. So he tried to have a referendum on it. It lost. He tried to get a vote through the Senate, through the lower house. It lost. So, there's a lot of talk about whether or not Italy is going to change its system or not. There was an attempt to try to do this before this next election. A lot of them are fearing that Five Star is going to become, the next government after the next election. So yeah, I mean, Italy is always an interesting example, and in many ways, of course, an outlier in the experience of the use of proportional representation, because it's had some very, very distinctively different historical conditions than France or Germany or the Scandinavian countries or any of the ones that we normally look at. Again, France, of course, not a PR country either for most of the post-war period, but an interesting one nonetheless.
Okay. This person says, most of the people I know are pro-PR, but I have a friend who keeps resisting and saying that she will end up with an MP she doesn't know, who might be chosen by the party rather than the public, and won't be responsive to her. She gives the impression she has a personal relationship with her MP that she doesn't want to lose. What can I say to somebody like this?
Yeah, this is like a greatest hits. One of the things that we often hear about our system, and there's a lot of romanticism about our first past the post system and this sort of almost primordial connection between MPs and voters. I find it ironic because the size of ridings have increased 10 times since Confederation. So the number of people in a riding have increased, by a factor of 10. Which raises some interesting questions about what kind of relationship's going on there. I mean, if the relationship's really tight, how come we keep weakening it by putting more and more and more people? I mean, what kind of relationship can an individual MP have with all of these people if there's always more, right? Obviously, they can't have a very good relationship. The average Canadian doesn't even know who their MP or MLA or MPP or MNA is. Very few of them visit, their local representative. And that local representative is a glorified ombudsperson. Again, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with them. I'm sure they're very nice people. I think that if we had a properly functioning political system, most of what they do would be done by a bureaucracy that was fully funded and operational, which is what you have in Europe, right? Rather than our system where you go cap in hand to your local MP and you ask them for favors. It's a patronage system. And it's not a very good one. It's not a very effective one. It's not a very fair one because it usually benefits those who develop a personal relationship, which is often also a partisan relationship, with a particular MP, MLA, MPP, etc. So, yeah, you'll hear people who'll say this. They'll say they have this great relationship. Oh, it's so fantastic. 99% of the public have no relationship with these people. Really have very little idea what they do. They vote in an election on the basis of the party that they support, and the person who's running for them they know nothing about. So, what can we say to your friend? What are the trade-offs? Okay, you're worried that you might end up in a situation where the person in the local area is not someone you chose. Well, hey, that's what you've got now, right? The system you've got now is the one where most people end up with someone who's not who they want, okay? So maybe you're lucky, maybe that your friend lives in an area where her chosen party is the one that wins. Woohoo, great for her. But what about everybody else? I mean, shouldn't we have a system that gives everybody that relationship? And of course, PR systems often do. Because they're usually multi-member ridings, now everybody is probably going to get somebody that's closer to what they think. In a system where there's a local member and a party list, your friend is complaining about, oh, this party is imposing this person on them. Well, if they didn't vote for the local person, they can go to someone on the list. That's a lot more choice than they've got now. And a lot of people end up with someone who's chosen by a party in our system. Parties make all the decisions. Very few people belong to parties in this country. So who's forcing who to do what, right? I mean, parties are in charge everywhere you look because they're collective actors, right? They do the work of organizing people to vote. So the only difference is that in a PR system, voters have more accountability. It's easier to punish parties because the votes reflect what people actually voted. And voters can actually go to someone who agrees with them, which is not the case under our system, unless you're lucky enough to have your local member be the one that is the party you wanted. But we know that for most Canadians, that's not the case. So, I don't know, maybe you can't get through to your friend. Maybe your friend, just cares about herself. But if you can get your friend talking at the level of general values, what's good for everybody, what's fair for everyone, well, then maybe you can open up that discussion.
Yep. And I think it's important just to emphasize that all the PR models for Canada keep this idea of local representation and local representatives. So, I mean, if you know, if your friend is in a riding where the MP was elected with a lot of support, that person's probably going to get reelected under a PR system. It's just that they won't be the only MP representing those people. So if you voted for somebody that's different from your friend, you'll both have somebody to have the special relationship with.
Yes, and the other thing too is that, we hear this claim made about parties imposing people on us. Ooh, scary. But most of the modern transitions to PR have included legislation that forces parties to be transparent in the way in which party lists or members are nominated. They usually have to have some kind of open or public process, through which members can control the way in which the nominations are handled. And that's certainly not the case in our country. In our country, parties can have any rules they want, and they don't have to be open, So it's funny. I mean, the standard that's being held up is that somehow this other system will be not democratic or open, when in fact, almost all cases, they're much more democratic than our system.
Okay. This person wants to know, and I mean, this is a good question, and I'm glad that somebody is asking it because I'm sure there are a lot of people thinking it. Is there any point in continuing to press for PR given Justin Trudeau's reneging the way that he did?
Oh gosh, it's a perennial question, and I started working on this topic almost 30 years ago. My very first entry into the debate was preparing a 50-page paper for the Royal Commission on Electoral Reform and Party Financing, the Lordy Commission, which was traveling the country in 1988 and 1989. And I appeared before the commissioners as Joe Nobody, right? I was just a schmuck, who's clearly had nothing better to do than to write this paper. And I made the case that we needed a PR system. And while, they didn't give me the time of day, they were not very polite. And that reaction was fairly common, when I went to different parties, when I went to different, movements, they were like, what are you talking about? But it's been fascinating to see how things have changed. In my lifetime, it's been just a remarkable change in terms of the public's knowledge and the activist knowledge. And today, every party has to have a position. When we started to make some progress in this country, in the turn of the new century, I had said to people at the time, people were arguing about different systems. You had the SDB camp, you had the MNP camp, and I don't like your system. No, I don't like your system. And I said to people, look, don't get fussy because voting system reform doesn't happen very often. And grab this by the horns because it could go away. And actually, I've been proven wrong. I'm really happy to say that I've been proven wrong. Because even though we have not seen the breakthrough that we wanted, the issue is not going away. We have seen it resurface again and again. And that is really fascinating, and I think it speaks to a couple of things. One is the PR is answering a real problem. Often it arises because parties are having problems. They can't fix the political system. They're feeling insecure. So as long as we can keep them feeling insecure, we can keep this issue on the agenda. We don't want them to feel secure. The other part of it is that more and more people are finding out. More and more people are coming to understand that our current system is not a very good system, that there are better ways to do it, and they're starting to recognize the self-serving arguments of the political class, including our newspapers, who are clearly just talking out of both sides of their mouths to make this go away. So in that sense, I've been really encouraged by the results that we've seen and the hard work, of activists who just continue to plug away. And in my experience, and reading the broader kind of trends of political history, is that you often lose again and again before you win. And so you've just got to keep at it, right? You just keep slogging away. You keep delivering your message. You keep showing up. You keep fighting the good fight because you never know when it's going to break your way, right? You never know when the stars will align and suddenly you've got your opening. And you can push through to the end. So that's why all the work that Fair Vote Canada is doing and all the hard work that Anita is doing and all the hard work that you're doing, right, on the doorstep, talking to your friends, at the school board, any place that you are, it may feel sometimes like it's useless, what am I doing? But hey, that's how all effective political change has occurred, right? It all builds and builds and builds till we get to a tipping point and we push things over the top. So I would just say, even though it feels like we're losing, every time we lose, we have made more converts. We have raised the profile of the issue. We have more people saying, what the hell? We're doing it that way? And each time we get more people who are mad as hell and they just don't want to take it anymore. So we've just got to keep trying to galvanize that and pointing it in the right direction. And we'll certainly get an opportunity in this next election with the Liberals when we'll be able to say, why didn't you keep your promise? You know, you promised in unequivocal terms this was going to happen, and you didn't do it. And that's going to be on them. And, you know, a lot of people who may not know anything about the topic are going to turn and say, wait a minute, you said you were going to do it and you didn't. You better have some good reasons.
Yeah, I mean, and that's the silver lining of Justin Trudeau dumping this file so transparently. You know, it's not that he stepped back and said, gee, you know, we've been studying this since 1920, but I think we need another decade and another 15 committees, and let's do some more consulting. He just basically, when he couldn't get what he wanted, he said, that's it, pull the plug, put the new minister out there to say we're not dealing with this anymore, and he basically said in Parliament, if you don't like it, you don't have to vote for me next time, I'll take the heat. So in a way, he's not the favor that we wanted him to do, but he's done us a favor because he let this consultation go on for so long. He got so many people involved. It was a hugely intensive process. The entire media knows now that everybody who attended and all the experts wanted PR, and Justin Trudeau didn't. So he's raised the profile of this issue in a way that I'm sure he didn't intend to do, but is going to, you know, it gives us more leverage, and as a result, it's grown this movement. So I think, like Dennis said, you just don't know when the next window of opportunity is going to be. Just because you can't see it at this particular second doesn't mean that it's not there, and there are a lot of angry people out there. And in a first-past-the-post system, you don't need a lot of people to swing an outcome and get your message heard, like in a community or in terms of the election results. So I would just say, please carry on, because we need you. And somebody's asking, what has been the response of the NDP leadership candidates to our question around PR and their support? So I can answer that. When this race started, my thing I can hear a little feedback. When this race started, there was one candidate, Guy Caron, who was talking about PR. He put it as one of the two main issues in his platform. He announced it in a press release. He talked about it at every event because we get feedback from events, and the others were kind of like they would just answer the question if they were asked, and their commitments were very vague. And you know, the NDP like PR, that's a no-brainer, but that's different from saying this is a top priority issue for me, and I'm going to talk about this, and I'm passionate about it. So I would say up until around August, it was basically Guy Caron, and we were hearing not that much from the others. We did a campaign asking people to sign up to vote in the NDP leadership race, which was, you know, a little bit controversial, but that's what we do. We step in when we feel we can make a difference and influence a race, and I think we did have an impact because now all four of the candidates have fairly good platforms. They're all saying, you know, I'll introduce MMP, that's the NDP's preferred PR model, in the first mandate if we are elected government. All of them were asked a very important question for us, which is, what happens if it's not an NDP government? What happens if it's a minority government and you have some leverage? Will you make PR a condition? And that's really an important question that we wanted to know. And so far, Guy Caron has said that it is the condition of support of a minority government. The others have said, Jagmeet Singh hasn't said too much. He said, I'll consult with my caucus. Nikki Ashton and Charlie Angus have basically said, yes, it's a condition. I think they have several different priorities. So I think the way I feel about it right now is that we have a good place to work with any one of the candidates that could get elected, but if anybody still has to vote in the NDP leadership race, I'd encourage them to very carefully read the responses that are on our website that the candidates gave to our 4 questions. And it's going to be up to all of us to let the new NDP leader know, whoever that is, because we will work with whoever it is, that this is an important issue to a substantial number of voters, and particularly a substantial number of voters that are interested in voting for the NDP. So it's going to be up to us, just like what we did with Thomas Mulcair, to make this an issue no matter who gets elected. Okay, so somebody wants to know if Winnipeg had PR for some 50 years, why did they change it?
That's a great question, and it does beg the question when you hear about this experience. The answer, of course, is politics. The experience at the provincial level and at the municipal level reflected the competing interests of the different parties that were at work, not surprisingly. The Democrats, and their predecessor party, the CCF, they had a particularly fraught relationship with PR because up until the more recent period, the only time that voting system reform was ever considered was when the left appeared to be on the rise. And it was almost always used to try to deliberately rig the game against the left. So that created a kind of fortress mentality amongst leftists. And sometimes they confused different systems. Like, for instance, in British Columbia, they used the alternative vote, which was often called the single transferable vote mistakenly at the time because there was a transferable ballot. And this was deliberately introduced by a coalition government in British Columbia in the 40s. They introduced it in 1951 so that they could break up the coalition but not allow the CCF to win. Well, in the end, the coalition lost and a new party came on the scene, Social Credit, and they became the government instead of the CCF. Well, as you can imagine, the CCF were just furious. And this became party lore, that these voting systems are just about defeating the left. And it took me a very long time to get through to different people, who are connected with the NDP and try to clear up some of the confusion and misunderstanding. In the case of Manitoba, interesting process. Basically, the city was one large riding, one 10-member riding in 1920. This was introduced explicitly against the left. Labor, came out of the Winnipeg General Strike stronger than ever. In the very first election after the Winnipeg General Strike, which was after the fall of 1919, Labor won every single seat in the election that elected half of council. So this was what the provincial fathers were worried about. And so they quickly introduced a PR system for the city, just imposed it on them. It was a 10-member riding. That way they would dilute the Labor vote as much as possible. Now later on, they broke the system up into smaller ridings. And then eventually in the 60s, they did a municipal reorganization where they incorporated a whole bunch of outlying areas, Transcona, St. James, into the city of Winnipeg. And when they did that, they changed the wards to pie-shaped wards for the regional governance model. And when the NDP came to power in the 70s, one of their missions was urban reform. They were going to reanimate urban government. And so they felt that the PR system at the time was preventing progressive forces from doing the things that the NDP wanted. At the time, the NDP was very big on community resource boards and local input, all of which are great. But in dismantling the PR system, they underestimated the opposition that would emerge using a traditional ward system. And so that's what they did. So it was one of those unfortunate things that, higgledy-piggledy, through bits and pieces, the system was dismantled, it didn't work the way it was supposed to, and then eventually it was just tossed away. It wasn't gotten rid of because it didn't do what it was supposed to originally, which was to accurately represent what the voters of Winnipeg wanted, which it did quite well for most of its history. Certainly from 1920 to the 50s, it did that very well. After that, it was sort of, as I say, taken apart bit by these political fixers.
Okay. All right, so it's 8:30. I know I didn't get to everybody's question, and it's really nice to see almost everybody hung in with us. If you have more questions that are important to you, you didn't get answered, you can email me and ask them. If I can't answer them, then I will pass it on to Dennis. We have we did a survey in July, and we do periodic surveys of our supporters, and they asked for webinars on how PR works in other countries. Hopefully we've talked about that tonight. I know we didn't go specifically European country by European country, but we talked about the general themes of policy making, coalitions, the role of smaller parties, that kind of thing. And we have some upcoming webinars that people have asked for on how the PR system works. So the nuts and bolts, stuff that we don't need to talk to your neighbor at the table in the park about, but PR activists, when they get it, they want to know how it works. We have webinars for you on how it works, and we'll have some more general webinars on how to message to people effectively and that kind of thing coming up in the next year. So this is really a time for all of us to build before 2019, to talk to your neighbor, help build this campaign so that it's even bigger, so we can surprise the heck out of the parties who think that this issue is dead, who think it's hardly going to be mentioned in 2019, and we can surprise them. So when they're knocking on those doors, thanks to your work, they're going to hear about this issue. That's exactly what we want. So thank you to Dennis for taking his time to do this webinar with us. Again, much appreciated. If you want to help us grow the movement, the easiest thing you can do is ask a friend to sign our Declaration of Voters' Rights. fairvote.ca/declaration. That is how we build this movement, and how you found out about this webinar, and your friends can find out about it too if they sign our declaration. Please support us financially. fairvote.ca/donate. That's how we have money to be able to buy programs like GoToWebinar and put on stuff like this and help people in communities organize, is all individual donations from people like you who care. So please do consider supporting us financially and keeping us going while that next window of opportunity is coming, particularly about a year from today in British Columbia. They will be voting again on PR, and you can imagine if British Columbia succeeds this time, that will be a huge incentive federally, especially for the federal NDP, to put this issue on the table. So to run the biggest campaign possible, we need your support. All right, thank you very much, and have a good night, everyone. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, Dennis.